Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study. We're studying the Gospel of Matthew. In the first couple of days, we've seen that Matthew was a tax collector, called by Jesus to become an apostle. We've also seen that in verse 1, Matthew tells us the purpose of his book is to show us that Jesus is the son of David. He is the son of Abraham. He is the Messiah. And then Matthew begins his book with a genealogy, a family tree. In verses 2 through 17, Matthew gives the genealogy of Jesus. Now, we're interested to know that the genealogy begins with Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, verse 2, and then so on. He begins with Abraham because salvation history begins with Abraham. Remember we said yesterday that God's plan of redemption for the world began with Abraham. He called Abraham to be a man of faith. He called Abraham to leave his people behind and go to a promised land. He called Abraham to be in covenant with himself. And he told Abraham, of your seed, I will bless all the families on earth. Started with one man, Abraham. Out of Abraham's family became the family of God. Out of that very special family came the nation of Israel. And out of the nation of Israel would come the Messiah, who would be a direct descendant of Abraham. That's why Matthew begins his genealogical record with Abraham, for that's where God's great plan of salvation began, with this man of faith. Now, we've said Matthew was a tax collector, and so he had the mind of an accountant, very meticulous in detail. And we see that in this genealogical record, he is very meticulous, very organized in how he presents the family tree of Jesus. Starts with Abraham, and then he follows the line until we come to Jesus. But he breaks it into three parts. He says from Abraham until the time of David, there were 14 generations. From the time of David to the exile in Babylon, there were 14 generations. And then from the exile in Babylon to the time of Jesus, there were 14 generations. Notice the exact symmetry in the genealogy, the precision as God arranged his time perfectly. Through this family of Abraham, he will bring his son, his Messiah. Verse 17 says, thus there were 14 generations in all, from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile, and 14 from the exile to the Christ, or to the Messiah. So Matthew very carefully lets us know that God's plan is perfectly orchestrated, that at the perfect time, the seed of Abraham will come, the Messiah, the Christ, to bring us our salvation. Now, I've already noticed, of course, that prominent in the genealogy is Abraham and David. Abraham, the father of the faithful, and David, the great king, the true king of Israel, the man after God's own heart. And the Messiah, of course, would sit on David's throne forever. We see all that laid out now in the genealogy. Now, we're not going to take time to read the entire genealogy. You can do that for yourself. But I do want to point out a couple of interesting things that Matthew tells us in the genealogical record. Interesting because there are a few things that are not normally noted in genealogies of this time. And by that I mean, in Jesus' family tree, Matthew mentions 3 women. Actually, he mentions 4 when we count Mary. Notice in verse 5, he mentions Rahab. In verse 5 also, he mentions Ruth. And then in verse 6, he mentions Bathsheba. Now, normally in genealogies, only the men are mentioned, as is mostly the case in this genealogy. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob, and so forth. But in these 3 different times throughout the genealogy, then the 4th time, of course, when it comes to Mary, he mentions the women. Already in Matthew's account of the gospel, we see that the good news of Jesus is not just for men, it's for men and women, it's for all people. Now, of course, we know this was a patriarchal age where the emphasis was upon the men. It is a man's world, they would say. But Matthew makes it clear, even in the genealogy, that Jesus' view is that men and women are equally children of God. And by the inclusion of these women in the genealogical record, we see that the gospel, the good news, is for all people, for men, for women, for children. Everyone is included in the salvation that Jesus brings. We know that, of course, but to state it in New Testament times in that day and age was a revolutionary kind of a thing, a revolutionary idea. And we find it in the beginning of the gospel. It's not just men who hear the good news, it's men and women. And of course, obviously, Mary is mentioned as the mother of Jesus. And notice how very carefully Matthew says that in verse 16. When he gets to Joseph, he says, now Jacob was the father of Joseph. Joseph was the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ, the Messiah. You see, even in the genealogical record, Matthew's going to tell us that the birth of Jesus was different. He's hinting at the virgin birth, which of course he would give us in great detail in the rest of chapter 1. But already in the family tree, he makes mention. It doesn't say that Joseph was the father of Jesus. He says Joseph was the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called the Messiah. He's telling us already about the miraculous nature of the incarnation it witnessed to in the virgin birth. But we'll look at that in more detail in the latter part of the chapter. But I just love the way Matthew arranges so carefully his family tree, that at the perfect time, when all was ready, God sent the seed of Abraham, the Messiah, to save us. And that this salvation is for all, men, women, everyone is included in the saving offer of Jesus Christ. Amen and amen. You have a great day today, and I'll see you next time for our 5-minute Bible study in the Gospel of Matthew.